So central to Indigenous ways of knowing and being is the acknowledgement of our interconnectedness and the understanding of the need to nurture relationships and relationships of all forms. So relationship to self, to others, and to the community. So at the beginning of this process, we started to engage with our community partners, and questions were posed around how Indigenous ways of knowing would be utilized within not only the process, but also the analysis, and how contextual interpretation would be applied, and if there would be any opportunity to apply Indigenous ways of knowing to the data. So these questions really allowed for the development of the guiding principles that not only led the process here within Manitoba, but also allowed for the collective development of a data analysis framework that came from the knowledge of all of our partners. And so the biggest tenet of this process was really centering survivors' voices within all of our work. And as you'll see from some of our slides, we have survivors' voice brought into our presentation through interviewer quotes. The Manitoba approach worked very diligently to decolonize, really shifting the mindset on how the research took place, recognizing systemic hierarchies and positions of power within the context of research, and taking action to flatten these power imbalances. And this decolonial approach really required a shift in mindset and perspective, and blending that Indigenous worldview to be able to incorporate Western and Indigenous ways of knowing. So this approach included the collaboration of all partners throughout the process, not only in addition to also collaboration and working with those who were sharing their experiences as well. So again, this is about living the principle of reciprocity and reconciliation in action, and honoring and acknowledging survivors as co-creators within the process, and really presenting an opportunity for individuals to advocate from and for their own lived experience, focusing on the resilience and expertise of individuals and communities themselves. Next slide.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kendra Nixon, and I'm joining you from, looks like, a cloudy Winnipeg, Winnipeg being on Treaty 1 territory, the home of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene people, and of course the homeland of the Métis Nation. So I'm not going to go into our demographics in a lot of detail just for the sake of time, but I will point out some interesting things. And again, if you're interested about the demographics, you can attend our Q&A after. So as we've said, all of the participants that we interviewed identified as being Indigenous. They did vary according to age. As you can see, the age range was quite considerable, with the average age being 43 years old. All of the participants identified as being female, and we interviewed a number of the women from a number of areas. So women talked about being from a mix of geographical areas, which coincides with the scope of our project, looking at especially the experiences of survivors from northern, rural, and remote areas as well. Next slide. Almost all of the women who we spoke to were mothers and had a range of children. They also spoke about their children being exposed to domestic violence, being present when the violence was perpetrated against them by their partners. Most of the participants who we spoke to were no longer in relationships with their partners, but some still had some contact with them. And I also just want to point out the length of the relationships. The length of relationships were quite significant, with the average length being about 11 years. So these are kind of long-term significant relationships for women, which I think are really important when we kind of understand the context of their relationships and context of their experiences. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about 4 major themes today. These themes are the basis of our preliminary analysis. We still have more analysis that we want to do, but we did find 4 that we wanted to speak to today. And those are barriers for Indigenous women in terms of leaving violent relationships or accessing supports, the unique experiences of women in Northern communities, and we've heard a little bit about that from other presentations during this conference, mistrust of colonial systems, as well as the decision to leave. Again, almost all of the women that we spoke to had left the relationship. So it's really important to examine what were the factors in helping them leave and accessing support. So I'll first start with the barriers to leave. Women spoke of a number of barriers that they experienced when they attempted to leave the relationship. And a lot of those barriers related to formal supports, notably the police. Women talked about the fear of police, especially racism, that they would fear that police would not help them or that they would be charged as well. And you can see that in the first quote. Well, you know how the police treated her when she reported the domestic violence. Again, they were putting the blame on her and charging her with mischief or something. I was like, what? Really? Really, the cops can do that? And we know from the literature that dual charging is a reality for a lot of abused women, especially those who are Indigenous or really racialized women. Other barriers that women talked about were the lack of meaningful resources or material resources. Many were living in poverty. Many spoke about the lack of transportation and the lack of having access to a vehicle. And when you're looking at the experiences of women living in rural, remote, and northern areas, the lack of transportation is significant. We know that bus lines in the north have been eroded or totally dismantled over the last number of years. So this was a major issue for women. And we can see in the one quotes here where she talks about not being able to get a bus, or that it was on her own ability to find a bus to seek shelter as well. Other, women in the second quote talked about not having a vehicle. So significant barriers. And next slide, please. And Angie will talk about the next two themes.
Thanks, Kendra. So as Kendra mentioned, we had some particular themes around experiences of survivors within Northern communities. So the distinct and unique challenges experienced by folks within Northern, rural, remote, or isolated communities very often stems from a lack of access to supports and resources, which is really reflective of that structural marginalization that contributes to risk factors for individuals who are experiencing violence and those barriers to access support. So these inequities in services can include lack of access to mental health supports, housing, family violence shelters, as Kendra mentioned, transportation, food security, economic opportunities. And these barriers to accessing support, again, are a major contributing factor and must be provided for to be able to provide safety for individuals who are experiencing domestic violence. And it's important to reflect back on the kind of the historical multi-generational and collective trauma that stems from historic and current systemic violence that Indigenous folks are facing, and that these often perpetuate trauma rather than facilitating healing. And the continued social and economic marginalization is really firmly embedded into many policies, such as housing, and that these conditions really uphold, maintain, or in fact can worsen the conditions as a contributing factor to violence. So the continued maintaining of this status quo and inadequate funding or inadequate funding really is particularly felt by folks within Northern, rural, isolated, or remote communities where services are minimal at best. Next slide. Another really important theme that we saw come through the preliminary analysis was the mistrust of colonial systems. So again, historical and contemporary systemic racism resulting from the colonial processes within in Canada and the inadequate provision of services and programming, in particular for Indigenous people, compared to the rest of Canada, really puts Indigenous women and gender diverse folks at risk. Oppressive legacies that still remain embedded within policies, institutions, and social structures really lead to that perpetuation of cycle of violence that's structurally upheld by systems. And this understanding of oppressive legacies is not something that's new. It's been spoken about for many years. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People really highlighted the inequality of power imbalances in relationship to structural violence and the impacts that that has on Indigenous people. So this is not something new, but definitely still something we feel is very important to speak to and continue to raise until we see true meaningful change take place. This structural violence, again, is not historical. It is contemporary. It continues to impact Indigenous lives, in particular, in regards to accessing systems which are there to support, supposed to be there to support, but often are viewed as a system to be feared. And this undertaking of how these power dynamics exist within systems and really create vulnerabilities for Indigenous women has to be explicitly named, or we will never be able to make that true shift and that meaningful change that starts to create safety for Indigenous women. And this is why we really felt it was important to situate the approach that was taken within Manitoba within the understanding of historical, contemporary, legal, social, structural violence that continues to impact Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse folks. Next slide.
So I'll just finish up with the last theme that we're going to speak to today, and that is the decision to leave. And again, as I said before, most of the women that we talked to, or almost all, had left their partners. So it's really important that we look at, what factored into their decisions. And primarily, women talked about their children. So again, many of these women were mothers. They talked about how factoring in their decisions about leaving really revolved around the needs of their children. And this is, evidenced in much of the literature that women take into account the needs of their kids, whether they stay or leave their relationship. And so women talked about that as well. And so the first quote highlights that. I always have to remember that without my children, I'm nothing. They mean so much. I love my kids and I wouldn't want to go nowhere. So I'll take care of myself. Everyone deserves to be loved and to love, to be respected and to be treated. So women talked about the importance of their children and how they factored them into their decisions. They did not want their children to be exposed to the violence. They saw the impact the violence was having on them. And women also talked about being fearful that they would grow up to be future perpetrators or victims of violence if they didn't leave the relationship themselves. Women also talked about the importance of their faith or their cultural teachings. So the second last quote, I didn't seek resources for that except my faith. Yeah, so back to survival, my faith is a major factor in my survival and in my healing. And with the women who we spoke to, their connection to their culture, their connection to cultural teachings was really, really important and helped them not only in their leaving decision to leave, but also in their recovery. And then lastly, women talked about just having love and respect for themselves, that they thought that they realized that they were worth something. And again, their cultural teachings gave them that insight. And on the contrary, there was a lot of women who said they didn't leave because of issues of low self-esteem, lack of confidence, low self-efficacy, those kind of things. So next slide, please. So that concludes our presentation. Again, we presented very quickly on 4 themes that arose out of our preliminary analysis. We're excited to do more analysis. However, if you do want more information, you have our contact information here.